I'd like to speak today about the continuing struggle to make war more humane and some of the difficulties that were involved with that in part two of our discussion about that. We talked about last time about some of the codes that were involved in terms of the Libra Code and the Geneva Conventions, in terms of trying to make war more humane and trying to restrain some of the problems of war, some of the excesses of war. It's interesting when you look at some of those codes, though, that were formed to do that. There were carve-outs in those very codes, so the codes themselves were not really complete. Some of the carve-outs were for people of color, so they were, not to be part of this, not to be treated in the same way as everyone else. Muslims weren't covered. Native Americans were not covered. There's also an allowance in the codes for imperialism. For example, in the Belgian Congo, and the idea was, well, it was okay to go to some of those excesses because they were exporting Christianity, or they were exporting European civilization. So, well, it's okay because really your intent is a religious intent. So the craziness here of allowing horrible things to happen to people, the natives in those countries, because after all, what you're doing is ultimately good. It's the end is good, right? I mean, Christianity, religion, good one. So don't worry about the excesses. So obviously, you can see the codes had many limitations. There was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment represented in the codes. So you can see how the racism that we're dealing with even today was embodied in many of those codes. For example, in the Philippine-American War, 1/7 of the entire population was killed. So the Philippines were conquered, America won, but 1/7 of the entire population wiped out. Can you imagine? I mean, 1/7. Incredible, right? The writer H.G. Wells says that, this movement for more humane war and curbing the excesses of war and trying to limit the horrors of war, great movement, great idea, wonderful concept, very well intentioned. The people behind it trying to do good stuff, obviously. But what did it lead to? It leads really, paradoxically, to the persistence of war. When we're confronted with the horrors of war and the absolute terribleness of it and the destruction and the evil of it, we're more shocked and more willing to say, forget about it. Whereas, with the humane war approach, sometimes it backfires and people are like, well, we tamped it down a bit. It's not that bad. It's okay. We've got to do it. It's important, and so we make rationalizations for things that we would otherwise say, well, wait a minute, this is, we shouldn't be involved with this. Uh, and really, when we think of war, we think of it as an abomination. We think of the famous expression of Pope Paul VI that the United Nations, war never again, because of just the sheer horror that happens. We see the destruction. A lot of times, soldiers will be the first to tell us, war, no, anything to avoid war. And a lot of that comes from their experience of seeing what it does to their fellow soldiers. Imagine the horror of seeing, body parts all over the place and everything. People that you were just talking to and completely destroyed. I mean, just the horror, the sheer, terror and horror of war and the abomination of it, and seeing that and really forming a response based on that. And then, of course, was introduced into all of this was aerial warfare, which brings a whole other aspect to it. And aerial warfare, of course, increases the violence to the civilian population. I mean, how do you curb that violence to people who are just these innocent bystanders, and of course that plays into the whole concept that people have with the just war theory and the difficulty of it in today's day and age because of the use in bello concept, the idea of justice in war, and how do you curb the excesses that happen from aerial bombardment. Very difficult. Not only the mistakes that pilots make, human error, I mean, to pinpoint exactly, very difficult, but then also the idea of the targeting and getting that information wrong. Well, I put it on the right target, but that target turns out to be the wrong target, and it's the home of this family, and this innocent family is destroyed, not involved in the war directly as combatants, but they're killed as a result of the bombardment. Good example of that is the Korean War. 4 million people died during the Korean War. Half of those 4 million, 50%, were civilians. Again, the intensity of the bombardment, the intensity of the aerial warfare, just horrible. And of course, we saw that with Vietnam, and we've seen that now with the problem, of course, with drones and the targeting. Very, very difficult to pinpoint these things, and the civilian casualties that are caused are a horror. Some progress, though, has been made. I mean, it's not all a bleak picture. For example, during the Civil War, 450 cases of sexual assault were prosecuted under the Lieber Code, the Lieber's Code. So that code, even though it excluded certain people, uh, really did establish the idea of the sexual assault during war being wrong, which really we see even today, all these horrible stories of the sexual assault that happens in some of these countries during war, the rape, the horror that happens to certain parts of the population because, again, people have no standards with regard to it. So that was, some progress there. The Lieber's Code also brought black women under the umbrella of legal protection. So not only were the white women protected, but many of the black women as well. So that was a positive development, and established the modern understanding of rape as a war crime. So when rape is committed during war, it can be prosecuted, and there have been, of course, examples of that taking place. Of course, then you get into the whole Vietnam War and the My Lai tragedy, where so many innocent civilians were killed. Human Rights Watch developed to monitor those types of situations. Military lawyers have inserted themselves into picking targets, so they're trying to evaluate the targets as to doing the least damage to the civilian population. 9/11, though, comes along, and what happens is humanitarian codes were definitely flouted. John Yoo wrote his famous torture memo, basically giving limitless presidential authority to war making, saying that the president has this superior knowledge, so he's able to do these things. And the difficulty involved with that is all of the tragedies, and how do you restrain then the president in that situation? President Obama speaks about the global battlefield, the use of drones, 10 times as many drones used under the Obama administration as previous administrations. And of course, the thought there was to try to limit in some way the civilian casualties and the casualties among the soldiers. But of course, as we know, that was not accomplished with the drone strikes. Assassination of many leaders became self-defense. So we will assassinate him using a drone because potentially he might do harm to us. and they developed this doctrine of elongated imminence, strikes against targets that don't actually pose an immediate threat, but in this elongated sense of imminence, they might somewhere down the road, they might threat uh, be a threat. The number of terrorist groups, of course, has expanded greatly, and of course, that battle against terrorism. The war powers resolution, as we have it now, requires congressional authorization after 90 days of hostilities. But this resolution has been so altered and the definitions changed that it really has become kind of meaningless. Uh, John Brennan made his famous statement about the drone situation. He said there hasn't been a single collateral death as a result of what we've done. We know, of course, many, many collateral deaths. And the problem with the collateral deaths is the creation of new terrorists. Because if your family is destroyed by a drone attack, you're more likely, and it comes from the United States, of course, you're more likely to say, well, I'm going to side with the terrorist, and it winds up creating more terrorists in the long run. We presently have wars that are waged in 19 countries involving 41 operations. So that's how expansive the military imprint of the United States is just currently. Amazing. A great example of that, of course, was the car bombing near the Kabul airport. We said that we were targeting a terrorist group. Turns out, what happens? It was a worker at an American aid group, his children, and a former army officer. So the difficulty is, of course, reining in these excesses. And now we talk about our over-the-horizon capabilities that we will have. Again, the use of these drones on an expanded basis. So it raises for us a lot of questions about, can we really rein in the excesses of war? How do we go about it? What are all our alternatives in doing so?